Hello and welcome to Real Crusades History. I've got an exciting topic for you guys today. I've gotten some requests for this, and so I've decided I'm going to do a little video series about the kings of Jerusalem for the Latin Crusader kingdom. And I've already done a video about Godfrey of Bouillon, so I'm going to start with a video about Baldwin I. So this is going to be good. Baldwin I is probably my favorite king out of the entire set of kings of Jerusalem. He really is a fascinating personality. He was really one of the brilliant minds of his era, and he was able to achieve something remarkable, which was essentially the creation of the kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, what do I mean by that? Oftentimes, we hear this idea that Godfrey of Bouillon was the founder of the kingdom of Jerusalem. And that is true to an extent. But Godfrey's reign was very short. And at the time that he died, the kingdom was still very, very small and in its infancy. Baldwin I takes power, and he really embarks on a very energetic campaign to expand, secure, enrich the kingdom of Jerusalem. So what he started with in 1100 when he took the throne, and then what he ended up with in 1118 were very, very different. And it's amazing considering the limited resources he had. It really kind of shows us what kind of a person he was. So we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about his unique and dynamic personality and how that helped shape the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem and how he really did build it. He was kind of the founding figure, if there is one. So, who was this man, Baldwin I of Jerusalem? Where did he come from? Well, he certainly wasn't born with that name. He was born in Baldwin of Bouillon. He was the son of Count Eustace II of Bouillon, who was a very important nobleman, and he was the third son. So right away, we can see that he was not expected to be some huge figure. He certainly wasn't really expected to be a king, by any means. He was destined for the church, like a lot of younger sons, and he did study in the seminary. So he was educated, which was also a unique thing for a nobleman during this period. Well, what I mean, of course, by that is a literary education. He was taught Latin. He was taught church law. And this is something that he would take with him for the rest of his life. He was known to be well versed in the laws of the church, and he could quote them pretty freely. So he was an intellectual. But he did decide that the clergy was not for him ultimately. And he opted to not finish his studies, not to become a priest. His two older brothers had high positions. Of course, his oldest brother, Eustace, who became Eustace III of Bouillon, he succeeded his father as Count of Bouillon. His next oldest brother, Godfrey, very famous Godfrey of Bouillon, became the Duke of Lower Lorraine. He inherited this from his uncle, who had no sons of his own. A very, very important and powerful position. Baldwin didn't have any kind of position like this, so he became what is called a household knight to his brother Godfrey. But I think it's pretty clear that he was ambitious from the get-go. And we start to understand this as we look at his career during the First Crusade. So he planned to be more than a household knight. I want to talk a little bit about his personality and his physical appearance. To do that, I'm going to turn to William of Tyre. William of Tyre, of course, is the great historian of Outremer. He was the Archbishop of Tyre in the late 12th century, so he was later than Baldwin I, but he obviously would have known a lot about him. So his description of him is pretty useful. So this is from William of Tyre. He says, "He is said to have been very tall and much larger than his brother," that would be Godfrey, "so that as it is written concerning Saul, he was higher than any of the people from his shoulders and upward. He was of rather light complexion, with dark brown hair and beard, so that would be different from Godfrey too, because Godfrey was blonde, so Baldwin had very dark hair. His nose was aquiline, and his upper lip somewhat prominent. The lower jaw slightly receded, although not so much that it could be considered a defect. He was dignified in carriage and serious in dress and speech. He always wore a mantle hanging from his shoulders. Because of his gravity, both in word and habit, he appeared to those who did not know him more like a bishop than a layman. Nevertheless, there is no doubt that he was a descendant of Adam and an heir of the original curse, for he is said to have struggled in vain against the lustful sins of the flesh. Yet so circumspectly did he conduct himself in the indulgences of these vices, that he was a stumbling block to no one, neither did he inflict violence or great injury on anyone. In fact, a thing rare in such cases, only a few of his personal attendants were aware of his licentious habits. If, like all sinners, his partisans try to find excuses for him, it seems possible that some may be found acceptable, if not with a strict judge, at least among men, as will be related in the following pages. Baldwin was neither stout nor unduly thin, but rather of a medium habit of body. Expert in the use of arms, agile on horseback, he was active and diligent whenever the affairs of the realm called him. It seems unnecessary to speak in commendatory terms of his magnanimity and courage, his experience in the art of war, and of all the other excellent characteristics of a well-balanced mind. Above all, Baldwin avowedly emulated the Duke so closely that he considered it a sin in himself to depart in the least detail from the example set by his brother. So what William is saying there, he's referring to Baldwin's brother, Godfrey Bouillon. Baldwin was apparently a big admirer of his brother, although I think it's fair to say that in terms of his achievements, he seems to have eclipsed his brother considerably. I think this all gives us a pretty good idea of what sort of man Baldwin was. The image I think that's emerging here is of a man who was intelligent, well-educated, insightful, ambitious, highly energetic, very good at what he did, a very good warrior, a very good general, and also somebody who had good judgment and who was just in his dealings with his people. I also think we get a good physical image of him, too. He was tall. He was actually taller than Godfrey, as William tells us. And he had dark hair, so he had long dark hair, dark beard, and he had a light complexion. So he was probably a pretty physically imposing person. And also notice that William mentions that he dressed he always was well dressed. He always had some kind of fine mantle on. Unlike his brother, Godfrey tended to de-emphasize his grandeur. He didn't wear really fine clothes all the time. Baldwin did. The family that Baldwin and Godfrey came from was pretty interesting. Their mother was a very interesting woman. Ida was her name. She was unique in that she insisted on nursing all of her sons herself and educating them herself. This was a rare thing for the nobility at this time. They had nurses for their children. A great lady wasn't going to nurse her children at her own breasts, which now we would think that's pretty crazy. But she insisted on it because she said she wanted to keep them close, and also she wanted to ensure that she taught them to avoid sin. There's a little legend, actually, that when they were all three still young boys, a priest or some holy man told Ida that he'd had a vision that one of her sons would be a count, one would be a duke, and one would be a king. And of course, that would be from oldest to youngest. Eustace became Count of Bouillon, Godfrey became Duke of Lower Lorraine, and of course Baldwin, the youngest, he became a king. He became king of Jerusalem, the least expected to rise to such heights. So Baldwin I really comes into his own and really kind of comes onto the world stage during the First Crusade. And pretty quickly on, he emerges as a pivotal figure in the action of what's going on. Anna Comnena discusses him. Now, Anna Komnene is, of course, the Byzantine princess whose father was emperor at the time that the First Crusade was moving through Constantinople. So she may have seen Baldwin. It's doubtful that she talked to him, of course, because she would have been watching him from some, balcony or something, or some remote part of the palace where the women could kind of peer in and look at, what was going on. Greek women didn't really mingle with the affairs of the men the way Latin Western women did. But she mentions him and she discusses him. She didn't like him. She didn't like any of the Franks really, although she does seem to kind of admire their skills. But she does point out this interesting episode in which he does something that I think kind of reflects on his personality later. So I'm going to read from Anna Komnene right now. She says, Godfrey himself was invited to cross over from Pelicanum to watch the ceremony. When all, including Godfrey, were assembled, and after the oath had been sworn by every count, one nobleman dared to seat himself on the emperor's throne. Alexius endured this without a word, knowing of old the haughty temper of the Latins. But Count Baldwin went up to the man, took him by the hand, and made him rise. He gave him a severe reprimand. You ought never to have done such a thing, especially after promising to be the emperor's liege man. Roman emperors don't let their subjects sit with them. That's the custom here, and sworn liegemen of his majesty should observe the customs of the country. This is pretty interesting. This is from Book 10 of Anna Komnene's Alexiad. She's describing, basically, the Crusaders they were having counsel with Alexius. They had sworn the oath of allegiance to him to return the lands they conquered on a crusade. And some knight kind of, goes and sits on the emperor's throne, kind of being a haughty, sort of reckless Latin. And Baldwin reprimands him. I don't think that Baldwin necessarily liked Alexius or the Byzantines. I think what this kind of shows here is his pragmatism. And this is going to show up later in his reign as king of Jerusalem. He understood that they needed Alexius as an ally to succeed on the crusade. And so he was telling this knight, to knock it off, basically. Don't be a disrespectful ass in front of the Byzantine emperor. And this also kind of, throws back to Baldwin's career, as his almost career as a churchman, his studies of church law. He was pretty legally minded. And that kind of helped influence his role as king of Jerusalem too, I think. So moving on, as the First Crusade gets going, a lot of people view Baldwin as somebody who kind of veered off from the First Crusade. While the main army traveled to Antioch, Baldwin goes further east. He goes into Mesopotamia, and he takes control of the Armenian city of Edessa. In fact, he's invited by the Armenian population to become the ruler of the city because they're in fear of the Turks. And he does this. This is the beginning of the First Crusader state, the County of Edessa, centered around this wealthy and important fortress city, Edessa, on the Mesopotamian plain, on the eastern side of the Euphrates. Now, this is kind of an incorrect view to look at this as like, oh, well, Baldwin, here he is. The other crusaders are piously, engaged in the main crusade, and Baldwin veers off to make himself a prince somewhere. Well, what he did ended up having a profoundly positive impact on the First Crusade, because the County of Edessa that he established, and he began conquering other fortresses around Edessa and setting up this little county, this little territory. Edessa was very, very wealthy. There was a lot of merchants who moved through there. It was an incredibly rich city. It was also a strategically important city. It kind of gave the Crusaders access to the Jazeera and some of these regions closer to these eastern holdings of the Muslims. So it was strategically important. But also, he was able to send a lot of money back to Antioch. And after that hard winter of 1098, that was very useful. He also sent horses, he sent weapons, supplies. This is something that is often forgotten. how thoroughly and enormously he contributed to the cause at Antioch with this newfound state that he had established. And in fact, it's arguable that this is actually the moment when Godfrey becomes a really pronounced figure in the First Crusade. Prior to this, the two really big figures in the Crusade leadership were Bohemond and Raymond of Toulouse. Raymond of Toulouse because he was by far the wealthiest, had the biggest army, was the most prestigious. And Bohemond, who was the opposite, he was the poorest. He had no money. He just had like a small band of guys, pretty much a small army following him. But he was a military genius. He knew more about warfare, and especially warfare in the East, than anybody else did. And Godfrey was kind of just one of the other, important princes. His personality didn't really emerge. But at this point, it really does, because now his brother holds Edessa. And all of a sudden, Godfrey has access to a lot more funding than he ever did. And so he kind of emerges as one of the preeminent princes on the crusade. So rather than viewing the establishment of the County of Edessa as some kind of diversion and opportunity for personal gain on the part of Baldwin, and it was that, of course. Baldwin was ambitious. He used the crusade to kind of establish himself. But look how that actually helped the cause of the crusade. His success contributed to the crusade, and he was also pious. It's not just either or. For the first crusaders, for medieval knights, you could at once be seeking worldly success and also be devoted to the cause of the cross, devoted to religion and piety. That's what we've got here with Baldwin, and he contributes a lot to the success of the siege of Antioch, and he does everything he can to support it. So I think we can look at this really as the first kind of act of Baldwin as the great builder of the kingdom of Jerusalem. He carves out this important county of Edessa, which is going to become hugely important and helpful to the Crusader kingdoms in Outremer. And he does it early on. He does it, a year before Jerusalem is captured. So in 1100, Godfrey of Bouillon dies. And his brother, Baldwin I, is elected king of Jerusalem. We have to understand what it was he inherited. He did not inherit the fully formed operational kingdom of Jerusalem that we're used to thinking of, that was ruled over by people like Baldwin IV and Almeric and Fulk. Rather, he inherited the scattered beginnings of this kingdom. At the time, the Crusaders didn't hold very much. They held Jerusalem. They held a few fortresses. They had Tiberias. They had they had two seaports. They had Jaffa, and then Godfrey had conquered Haifa. So they had not a lot of territory yet, but they were kind of poised to do something pretty big if somebody had the wherewithal to make it happen. And Baldwin fit that bill. He immediately set out to take advantage of what little resources he had and absolutely make the most of them. So he immediately starts out on a campaign of conquests and consolidation of the kingdom. His policies are really brilliant and show kind of a farsightedness, a broad-mindedness that really was necessary to hold this precarious kingdom that was surrounded by enemies. First of all, he insisted on tolerance and free practice of the local Christians and the Muslims. In Antioch, the Normans tended to be less tolerant of the local Christian populations. This is something that Baldwin would not stand for. He allowed free practice for the Armenians, for the Maronites, for the Jacobites, these different Christian groups, the local Christians who had been there for centuries. He absolutely embraced them and insisted that they be treated well. And also, he had a policy of tolerance toward the Muslims. He allowed them to keep their mosques. Of course, the biggest mosques had to be changed into churches, but there were mosques that existed in cities like Acre, and he protected them as his citizens. He protected their property. The whole point of this, of course, was he understood that he needed a loyal and prosperous population that wasn't going to be tempted to betray him to, his neighboring enemies like Damascus or Aleppo or Egypt. And this became the standard practice of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The locals were allowed their practices, both the Eastern Christians and the Muslims. The Muslims, we would almost expect that they especially would have been oppressed, but we really don't see that in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And in fact, Muslims did very well in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And it was to the point that it shocked and offended some other Muslims looking in from the outside. They were thinking, what a disaster this is, that the Muslims prosper living in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and they don't want to leave. They don't want to flee to the lands of their co-religionists. Ibn Jubayr, who was a famous Muslim author, he has a passage that's often quoted where he discusses this, and he says that he's very offended by it. And he even says that the Muslims in the Kingdom of Jerusalem do better than the Muslims living under other Muslims. And this was kind of initiated and established by Baldwin, because really the church, the patriarch of Jerusalem, the early patriarchs like Daimbert, who Baldwin would really kind of butt heads with, they wanted a policy more of kind of oppression of the Muslims, and even of the Eastern Christians. And Baldwin wouldn't allow this. He allowed the Eastern Christians full use of the holy sites, and their rights were absolutely allowed, untouched. So really impressive. He won the loyalty of the people through that. He also had a policy of inviting Christian refugees from Muslim lands to come settle in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and he brought a lot of Eastern Christians into the city of Jerusalem itself, and they did well there. He had a policy, too, of ensuring that the church would be subservient to the crown, and this was kind of a pivotal issue. Early on, the churchmen who accompanied the First Crusade, for example, Daimbert, who ended up becoming one of the first patriarchs of Jerusalem, he insisted that Jerusalem should be governed by the clergy, and that Jerusalem should kind of be made into almost like the papal states. Godfrey almost seemed to be heading in this direction, is the interesting thing. Godfrey seemed to kind of go with this almost. His idea was that he was going to maybe turn Jerusalem over to the clergy once he'd conquered Ascalon. Baldwin would have none of this. He insisted that the church be basically just preoccupied with church matters, and he and the warrior class, they were going to do the governing. I think this was a very good decision because obviously the Kingdom of Jerusalem was a military state. I mean, if there ever was one, it had to be constantly ready for battle, and it couldn't really rely on the rule of a bishop to face off with the Muslims. He came into pretty serious conflict with Daimbert, who was Patriarch of Jerusalem, and tended to try to hide money from Baldwin and withhold the church's bounty at times when it was really essential for the survival of the kingdom. And Baldwin opposed this very seriously and even kicked Daimbert out at one point, and Daimbert went to Rome to plead his case, but Baldwin ended up establishing a new patriarch, Arnulf, who was more consistent with what he wanted. A supportive patriarch who was going to just govern the church, but also act as a minister to Baldwin's policies. And this worked very well. And this kind of became the pattern of the patriarchs of Jerusalem for the most part from then on. Usually they were friends, personal friends of the king of Jerusalem, and they supported him and acted as one of his great advisors. The interesting thing about this is Baldwin, having been in the clergy, really knew his stuff. And so when he was going through this period of turmoil with Daimbert, he was able to argue church law and quote it because he knew it. There's an interesting passage from Albert of Aachen, who documented Baldwin I's reign. He lived in Europe, so he wasn't an eyewitness, but he had good sources. And he describes this incident where Baldwin is in a dispute with the Patriarch Daimbert. And this really kind of shows Baldwin's personality. I mean, Baldwin was the kind of ruler who, when he was pushed, he pushed back very hard. So this is what he says. But the king could not put up with the patriarch's rude reply any longer, and he is reported to have spoken harshly and impatiently. See that you do not lightly throw this argument up at me, that those who serve at the altar should live by the altar, when there is an utmost pressing need that Christian soldiers should rather be fed from the altar than the Saracens carry off by force from the sepulchre and distribute the gifts of the faithful, and no soldier of ours nor a priest partake of them. The Lord lives. I shall devour not only the offerings of the faithful and distribute them to our soldiers, but I shall even rip out the gold from the Lord's sepulchre and altar in order to sustain the soldiers and defenders of the Christian people and the kingdom of Jerusalem. And after this, if it pleases the Lord God, and if the arrogance and threats of the Egyptian kingdom cease, and the land is peaceful, we shall restore everything. So I think, Albert of Aachen, this is not a direct quote or anything like that. That would have been impossible. But it kind of summarizes the point and the force of what Baldwin was saying to the patriarch, which is, look, we're in a very precarious situation. This is very early. This is like the first couple years of his reign. And we cannot afford to have the church not being a part of this overall larger effort to sustain the very existence of the kingdom of Jerusalem. So, Baldwin immediately, when he becomes king, starts out on this very great and impressive campaign of conquests. And he makes the most conquests of any of the kings of Jerusalem. He takes Caesarea in 1101. He takes Arsuf. He takes Acre in 1104. He takes Sidon in 1110, that one with the aid of the Norwegian Crusade. He takes Beirut in 1110. And then there's actually an incident in which he suffers a defeat against Toktakin, the emir of Damascus. Toktakin had invaded the kingdom of Jerusalem in 1113 from kind of across the Jordan at a bridge called Al-Sanabra. And Baldwin went to meet him there, and actually he was routed there. Although the army wasn't destroyed or anything, it was a problem. And after that, Baldwin set about securing the eastern flank of the kingdom. He built a castle called Montreal in Arabia on the eastern side of the Jordan. And then he built another one by the Red Sea. So this was in 1115. This was towards the end of his reign. But you can see from that period of 1101 all the way to 1115, he's really carving out and establishing the borders of the kingdom of Jerusalem. He also neutralized Egypt early on. He fought several major campaigns against the Fatimid Egyptians who were actively trying to reconquer the kingdom of Jerusalem from the Crusaders. They were kind of the first big threat. At this point, Damascus and Aleppo, there was a lot of internal tensions going on. There wasn't as much of a threat from those regions. Egypt was kind of the first big menace that the Crusaders had to face, and Baldwin very quickly neutralized that threat. By 1105, he pretty much made, that was pretty much the end of the Fatimids' ability to seriously attempt to conquer the kingdom of Jerusalem, although they would continue to try to harass the kingdom for many, many years to come. I actually want to read an episode from the first big engagement that Baldwin had with Egypt. This is from Fulcher of Chartres. And the reason I want to read this one, Fulcher of Chartres was Baldwin's chaplain. He knew him very well. He was very close to him, and he wrote about him. If you haven't ever read Fulcher of Chartres' entire chronicle, you really should get it, because it really is kind of the most intimate, confrontation you can have with the Kingdom of Jerusalem in this early period, especially concerning Baldwin I, because Fulcher was so close to Baldwin. This is a really interesting episode too, because Fulcher was actually at this battle. He was a priest, but he was at this battle, and he was actually with Baldwin I through most of it. He was next to him. So the action is just really vivid, and you get the feeling that, this is an account that really kind of brings us close to these really, really distant events. So Fulcher writes, "Already they had repelled and overwhelmed our two front lines, but the king, seeing this, brought aid from the rear with the greatest dispatch. When he saw that the strength of the enemy was greater, he rode up at full speed with his own squadron and vigorously opposed the attack of the infidels, brandishing his lance, from which flew a white banner. In the face of their superior might, he ran through an Arab opposite him. The flag remained in the Arab's belly when he was knocked to the ground from his horse. But Baldwin pulled out his lance, as I, standing near, witnessed, and he at once carried it, ready to slay others." So that's a really interesting episode to me. We really get the feel of Baldwin. He was a king who fought in the heat of combat. He was a knight. He took up a lance and he rode with his knights into battle. And he was victorious almost every time. He only lost 2 battles in his long career of intense fighting. The other interesting thing about Baldwin I is he was an incredibly good administrator of the larger Crusader states. He was the overlord of the entire Crusader state system. The County of Tripoli, the County of Edessa, which of course he'd established, and the Principality of Antioch. And this kind of became vivid and real in 1108. Tancred was really his biggest rival. Tancred tended to not want to submit to royal authority, and he didn't really like Baldwin. But Baldwin pretty much got the better of him and was able to use him to his advantage. As we all know, the Principality of Antioch and the County of Edessa in 1104 suffered a defeat at the Battle of Haran. And at that time, Baldwin of Edessa, this is Baldwin II of Edessa, Baldwin's cousin, was captured. And he was finally ransomed and released in 1108. And Tancred had the entire time frustrated that ransom and had been kind of a thorn in the king's side. Once Baldwin was released, Baldwin was the Count of Edessa, but Tancred had actually taken over Edessa in that time. Tancred was at the time the regent of Antioch. And he refused to give it back to Count Baldwin. And this, of course, caused a huge problem. And Baldwin I immediately went north and handled the situation. He demanded that Tancred hand over the city, and he required right then that Tancred and Baldwin swear an oath to him that they were going to respect him as overlord, and they did. And from then on, Tancred pretty much went with what Baldwin wanted to do. He couldn't really rebel against him. So this is kind of an example of his incredible strength as an administrator. And in addition to being the overlord of the Northern Crusader states, he also was very active in guarding over them. The Muslims, starting in 1110, really began to seriously try to invade and take over the County of Edessa and the Principality of Antioch. Every time they did this, Baldwin got the royal army and headed north and headed off the invasion. In 1110, he actually came up with a very brilliant policy after Edessa had been besieged by the Turks. And Baldwin showed up with the Count of Tripoli and their armies and lifted the siege, drove off the Turks. Baldwin actually said to his cousin, who was also Baldwin II, Count of Edessa, he told him, look, what you're going to have to do is move all of your peasants. They were all Armenians, like the people who lived in the County of Edessa were pretty much all Armenian Christians. You're going to have to move them all to the west side of the Euphrates. They're going to need to live in those regions because the Turks are going to keep plundering and attacking the lands on the east, and they can attack them more quickly. That way, Edessa, which was on the eastern side of the Mediterranean, and the castles in the region, which were heavily fortified and very strong military positions, will be in a position to resist the Turks, and they will have nothing in the countryside to plunder. And so they will be very quickly exhausted and unable to feed themselves. And this is exactly what happened. Because there was no more agricultural activity on the eastern bank, the Turks were really, really hard pressed and unable to make any advances against the County of Edessa. And this is really amazing because the County of Edessa, well, its chivalry, its knights were stretched pretty thin in the garrisons, protecting it against the Turks. Towards the end of his life, Baldwin decided he was going to start conquering stuff in Egypt. And in 1118, he actually set out on an Egyptian campaign, and that's where he died. He took sick, and he died. He was brought back into the kingdom before he actually died. And it was an incredible time of mourning. And, he was really remembered and understood to be just this outstanding king. And even the Muslims who were there, because there were obviously Muslim servants and stuff, local Muslims, they wept when he died. Because as I mentioned earlier, he was revered by the Muslims because he was fair to them. So Fulcher of Chartres talks about his death and sort of eulogizes him and summarizes what kind of a king he was. At the sight of this, and as if Baldwin were a kinsman, all who were present gave themselves over to mourning rather than song, to grief rather than joy. The Franks wept, the Syrians, and even the Saracens, who saw it, grieved also. For who piously wept there, could not control himself. Therefore, returning then to the city, the clergy as well as the people did what was fitting and customary for the sorrowful occasion. They buried Baldwin in Golgotha, next to Duke Godfrey, his brother, so he was buried in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Fulcher goes on. The epitaph of King Baldwin. When the king died, the pious race of the Franks wept, for he was their shield, their strength, and their support. He was the right arm of his people, the terror and adversary of his enemies, the mighty leader of his country, as was Joshua, Acre, Caesarea, Beirut, and Sidon. Also, he took from the impious native foe. Afterwards, he added to his rule and subjected to his authority the lands of the Arabs, or at least those which touched the Red Sea. He captured Tripoli, and with no less might took Arsuf, and likewise performed many other honorable deeds. For 18 years the king bore rule, then passed to his fate, as he was fated to do. So that right there is the life, the career of Baldwin I, King of Jerusalem. It's very impressive. He was obviously a pioneer in the Crusades movement. He was involved in the First Crusade, and he was really the builder, the founder of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. He started out in 1100 with a few scattered territories, and by 1118, when he was dead, you have a fully fledged kingdom, really, with borders, with multiple major cities, castles and fortresses everywhere. This was the foundation. Christopher Tyreman, in God's War, kind of discusses this. He says, Baldwin I's achievements were startling. He established a stable kingdom with defined and defensible borders from Beirut to Beersheba and beyond, controlled by a new, coherent political community whose power rested on exploiting existing resources of rural and commercial wealth. If he relied on force of personality and circumstance rather than law or constitutions, his idiom of authority was understood by his followers and clients. So that is my discussion of King Baldwin I of Jerusalem, the first king in title of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, although really officially the second king if you count his brother Godfrey. And I'm going to continue with that series. Next video, of course, will be about Baldwin II of Jerusalem, and we'll continue from there. I appreciate all of you for listening, for watching. please do, if you haven't yet, subscribe to Real Crusades History on YouTube. Become a subscriber so you'll always get the videos. Also, to support the channel, to offer your financial support, please click on the donate link in the About box. That's going to allow you to make a PayPal donation to Real Crusades History to support the work I'm doing. And finally, I do have a Facebook page for Real Crusades History. Click on that in the About box. There's a link to it. You can like us on Facebook. You'll always get the updates there too. Thanks.